So we did the past with Adam, Chris and Henry.
Yes.
We did the future with you and I.
Yes.
You and
today, we're doing the most important thing of all. The public, So in all the endless coverage of Labour's anniversary of its time in power, there has been enormous amounts of chatter and commentary and news being committed all over the place. But today, we are going to hear from the people that matter the most, the public. We're finding out what the voters really think. So, before we get going with this Sunday's episode of Newscast, Paddy, I must tell our newscasters that you are in something of a state.
I am.
Only because you might not sound your usual rambunctious self.
Yes, I'm in a complete state. I've left my phone somewhere, I don't know where. So I got up early because I had to do some work. Then I haven't found my phone. I'm late for the newscast.
Outrageous.
I didn't bring the mugs in, I promised.
Did you remember to spend an hour on Radio 4 between 9 and 10?
I think it's passed by in a blur. Happened.
It happened. So the listeners of Broadcasting House did have you with them between 9 and 10 o'clock this morning.
I had a version of me there, yes.
Excellent. Well, at least you are here in body, and maybe by the end of Sunday's Newscast, you'll also be with us fully in mind. But if, in case you're not, we've got Luke Tryl with us here, the director of the political research group More in Common. It's always good to have you with us, but you are here today because you and I spent half of Saturday talking to some very nice people, some voters in Kent from two constituencies, Gravesham and Dartford. I just wonder, I think people might be nosy about how these things actually work, Luke. So do you want to give us a précis of how focus groups work?
Yeah, so we think who are the demographic that we want to talk to? And in this case, we wanted to talk to people who had voted Labour at the last election. And we have a team of recruiters all around the country who, by all accounts, seem to know everyone in their communities. And they will recruit people to do market research. And this is really important because sometimes people think, oh, the people who go into focus groups are just like politics geeks. Actually, at the very first stage of recruitment, they could be coming to talk about anything from mouthwash to fried chicken to politics.
So they get paid?
They do get paid. So that is the incentive. That's how you get people who wouldn't normally go to, say, Question Time or something like that, because they're being paid to come. So we select on that basis. We try and get a group who are kind of representative of the areas, and then we tell them at that stage, obviously before they come on to record a focus group, that's going to be about politics, and most of the time people stick and they still do it. And then we bring them together in the focus group, and that's when I will then take them through a series of questions, designed to really get under the skin of, what do you think about this government? What they're doing better? What they're doing less well? And what do you think about the man in charge?
And it's interesting, Paddy, when you watch these groups being done, it is a completely different thing to what we do as a job, right? You are not interrogating people. You're not even really asking them questions. It's more sort of prompting them to open up about what they think. And I think that's a really important difference.
Yes, and I would just wonder that there's an awful lot of street interviews. I've interviewed everyone in the country on the street. In my career, there isn't anyone left who I haven't interviewed on the street. There is this general patina of they're all the same, nothing ever changes, and actually they're not all the same, and plenty changes. So actually, the public, when they say this stuff, you think to yourself, actually they're not. Is it hard to find optimists? Is it general tone of British people in focus groups? It was better in the 1950s when we had whistling postmen and and no internet.
I mean, there's certainly a big chunk, and we see this in our polling too, of the country who think Britain's best days were in the past, that it's not very optimistic looking forward. I would say the past 2 years in particular have been particularly grim in focus groups. Just this real sense that the cost of living crisis in particular does just seem to have sort of almost beaten the joy out of lots of people. So it is definitely pessimistic.
So let's just bring people, if they didn't see it on the telly this morning, if they were listening to Paddy being lost on Radio 4, let's just give people a flavour of what the kind of tone was. And of course you can watch the whole thing back on the iPlayer, but here for newscasters is a flavour of how people thought Labour's first year has gone.
I've always been a Labour supporter. My parents were Labour, and I think as an adult I expected much more from them. Would have expected Labour to have pulled themselves together sufficiently.
Everything that they promised and said that they were going to do, nothing's really come of it as of yet.
And is there anything particular that they've done that's disappointed?
Immigration is a big thing for me.
I feel like at the moment it's patching things up. That's why I look at this first year as it's not really the year to sort of push the ideologies, push those big ideas. It's kind of, let's sort of shore things up, let's steady the ship almost.
I think a lot of things that were promised, even if I voted for them, were never going to be possible. I don't think any political party is honest.
I don't see like any kind of difference so far. And what I have just come across is like, you know, they're blaming like the previous party about like those kind of things.
The Prime Minister admits that they overdid the doom, because for the Prime Minister to come in and say things can only get worse was such a bookend to Tony Blair's arrival in '97, which had the word "things can only get better." So we've gone. So he admits that was bad. So of course, if you're telling the country it's broken all the time, the NHS was broken, the public services were broken, everything was broken, then inevitably it's very hard to think, well, you can't fix it in a year. You can't fix Britain in a year. So did they sort of deliver their own verdict on the country, which is reflected on them as a government?
Yeah, I do think that's part of it. I think the mistake that this government made was thinking that they could play the Tories' 2010 playbook in reverse. It was to come in and say, we're going to do bad stuff or tough stuff, but it's because of the mess that the other lot left behind. But they ignored the fact, and we get this in every single group, people basically say, we've had tough choices since the financial crash. When is the good stuff going to come? And that's what you really got in that focus group. It wasn't that people expected miracles from the government, and they were quite generous, I think, actually, some of them, in saying, well, you know, they've only had a year. But there was that real impatience, that sense that there's just too much stuff that isn't working at the moment. When are we going to get to the stage where it's fixed?
That's right. And this group was people who'd all voted Labour last time round. It's important to say that. And it was very clear that I felt some of them felt really gutted. Not sort of furious, you know, it wasn't like a room full of furious voters who are, you know, saying, let's put him in the stocks, but just like really gutted that it's just been quite grim. And I was struck. It seemed to me as a group, and having sat through focus groups on various occasions over the years, they were all speaking sort of more sorrow than anger. And it is that disappointment. I think I didn't count the number of words, but disappointment felt to me like it was the most common word and probably the most commonly expressed sentiment. But I was quite interested as well. There was a sort of grudging patience. You know, there were some in the group who actually were a bit generous in terms of saying, a year's not long enough. You know, one woman said, a year, I can't sort anything out significant in my personal life in a year. And actually the government is not going to be able to sort things out in a year. And I suppose for the government, it's how long that those people will be willing to be patient and willing to wait. But they didn't have a particularly positive view of the leader himself. This is what they said about Starmer.
Imagine you are Keir Starmer's employer. What would be the sort of one sentence which would sum up your appraisal?
Keep up what you're doing, but I feel like you need some direction now because I feel like you're being attacked.
Try harder or you're going to lose your job.
I need to see some evidence from now going forward.
Show more evidence of your work and communicate better.
Disappointing, you're fired.
So I suppose the question is how many of those voters are sort of lost for good, and then how many of them might come back. But Luke, from that group, and also you guys have done another big poll today, what has actually been shifting? You know, what's on your mind this weekend? Because this trend has been there for quite some time, but at this moment in time, particularly, what's been moving?
So I think the biggest difference, and I think this is the real risk to the government, is yes, you know, people are willing to give them more time. They know the country is in a mess, but what they want then is that grown-up government that Keir Starmer promised when he came in. And I think that is the big difference this week. So we had some new polling in the Sunday Times conducted after PMQs on Wednesday. And what had shot up in that polling was the sense that this government was chaotic. So 7 in 10 saying it's just as chaotic or more chaotic than the last Tory government.
7 in 10.
7 in 10 saying that. And, you know, we know from our polling and previous groups, people booted the Tories out in large part because of the sense of chaos. And so I think more than anything else, more than the individual policy, more than, you know, the welfare specifics, it's that sense of, has Keir Starmer lost control? Because again, in that polling, clear majority saying Keir Starmer is not in control of his party. Fewer than half of Labour voters saying Keir Starmer's in control of his party. And I think that's what they've got to tackle more than anything else. And, you know, going into the summer, into recess, if I were advising Number 10, it's what can you do to show the Labour family as a united front? Because the public hate division.
And also, I mean, the thing is, you can't actually overestimate how chaotic the Conservatives' last few years were.
Yeah.
And we're saying that quite a lot. We only have to remember what happened with Liz Truss, and we only have to remember Rishi Sunak's election campaign, which began in the rain and then had a catastrophic error of political judgment over the Normandy commemorations last year. So they're right. Labour's right to say they inherited a pickle. But the public seem to think, stop giving me doom. Show me the money, show me some results. That seems to be where the public mood is. And I think that we've said this before with this joke from Alan Johnson about don't tell me about delivery, I used to be a postman. So what they've got on their side is time. You've told me that there are members of the public who are going to be patient with them. They've got 4 more years. Luke, what is the state of the polling you've done for the Sunday Times? And can it shift in 4 years? So so we start with the Sunday Times polling and then answer if they can shift.
Yeah, so at the top line, the two figures are we did one of these MRP polls, which some listeners will remember from the last general election. That's where we do a very big sample, 11,000 voters, and try and look like what individual seats would come out like if there were an election. Of course, there isn't an election. It's very hypothetical. But in that, we had Reform UK on 290 seats, Labour on 126.
Wowzers.
The Tories falling even further back from their election result last year on 81, ahead of the Lib Dems on 73.
That's quite something. And we should say it's one poll. Polls suggest we're miles away from a general election, but it does show you how Reform being in pole position in the polls, would actually translate into them being way, way, way the biggest party in Parliament, which would be quite something. But we are miles and miles and miles away. But one thing also that I think Labour has in their favour, as well as time, is that the Tories are not cutting through at the moment. I mean, they're just not. The polling shows us that they're consistently in third place. Labour has on their side that the Tories aren't really cutting through. But of course, Nigel Farage is a big, big threat to them at the moment. And there was a lot of curiosity and a lot of warmth also to Nigel Farage in the room. Let's go back to Dartford.
Is there anyone else that you think might be doing a good job right now or could do a good job in that role?
I really like Reform.
And what do you think about their leader?
Yeah, I like him. I didn't, but it was I'm a Celebrity that turned my head for Nigel, not going to lie. I really saw a different side to him, and I think he's very misunderstood.
I think he's more relatable to the people, to the average person, where some politicians at the present seem far removed. They're so in another world because they're usually public school educated. They can't relate to the average person.
Nigel Farage was
Sorry.
public school.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, whereas actually Keir Starmer is working class, but he does present that. So Nigel Farage puts on this image of being one of the people, but actually he went to private school.
Okay, that's interesting.
What about, how many of you know who the Conservative Party leader is? Just a quick show of hands. If you do that.
I can't remember. I know.
About Haas? About Haas?
I can't say her name.
I think she's quite argumentative.
I mean, that's quite startling that half of your focus group couldn't name Kemi Badenoch. And also, back to my earlier question, could Labour pull this situation round?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The flip side of the electoral volatility, which means Labour is now behind in the polls, means that, in 2 years, we could be looking at a totally different set of numbers. We're a long way from election. One thing I would say is lots of polls at the moment are less actually about picking between parties and more a referendum on their disappointment with the government. And, just look at Canada, Australia. We look at, Boris Johnson 4 years ago. Elections and voters turn, but I think if we got that group back together in a year's time and there was still no sense of progress, I think that's when you get the more generous ones who are saying, look, it takes time, we know it's not going to be easy. I think then they'll start to lose some patience. So I think year 2, almost more important than year 1 for the government actually in sort of correcting those early mistakes and showing progress.
I think that's absolutely right, because I think the positive spin that you could put on this last week of shambles and this very difficult 12 months is actually, there's a huge opportunity here for learning. They've understood, and had it shown to them what can happen if they don't make arguments properly, had it shown to them what happens if they lose control of the argument inside their own party. They've seen every week how bad the polls are for them now. This could be a sort of inflection point, if you like, for the government to get itself together, I'll say more diplomatically.
So, and there is a way for the government to gain political advantage from wins in big public sectors. So falling health lists, health waiting lists, then growth in the economy, and also a win on small boats. If they can deliver anything at all, to Luke's point, show me something that's working, that will rebound very well for them. And so we've tried to make that point on this, on our weekend newscast. There's a way through. Plus time plus results equals success.
And equals also still having an absolutely enormous majority that they're sitting on. So even though the polls are grim, and even though this last 7 days have been a complete car crash and they obviously didn't make the arguments for welfare properly inside their own party, but they still have a huge minority and they've still got 4 years. So it would be crackers at this point to say, oh, it's either a success or they're completely doomed. That's nuts. However, this is a point, and I think a lot of people in the party would say this too, this is the moment where they have to go, okay, now we're going to learn it. And some people do recall, and say, actually, New Labour the first year, they did loads of stuff, but they didn't really know what they were doing. The difference, of course, is they came with lots of plans that were absolutely ready to go, like Bank of England independence, like devolution, there's big ideas that created a sort of huge sense of progress and momentum and things happening really quickly.
Yeah, and look, if you look back in more recent history, 2012, George Osborne is booed at the Olympics. You get the omni-shambles budget,
sausage rolls, caravans, pasties, second homes, all of those things.
It seems a very innocent time. I'd love in the news to be talking about caravans and pastas. It would be really exciting. No, that's really good. I hope I didn't interrupt you. That did happen. Booing the Chancellor at the Olympics definitely is up there with the Chancellor weeping in the Commons.
Yeah, and then they won in 2015, right? So, we don't have to look back very far for realising how things can change very quickly. And, Boris Johnson won an 80-seat majority and then was out on his ear not so long later.
We asked newscasters yesterday to get in touch, and thank you if you did. Newscaster Jeff from Kent says, I was watching Laura's Sunday morning show, unfortunately glazed over when the Labour MP Bridget Phillipson blamed the previous lot for all their problems yet again. An anonymous newscaster said, Keir Starmer's a grown-up, he's honest, he's reliable, he listens. I think he stands for the common good and the common man. Maybe that was Keir, and maybe that anonymous texter is Keir.
Prime Minister, if you're listening, welcome along.
Tony from Salford said, what I don't understand is how could the Labour working class party get it so wrong, planning changes to a critical welfare system without first ensuring they have the backing of the majority of their own MPs?
Yeah, I think it's that. It's that sense of, and we actually asked, who do you blame for the welfare mess in that polling this weekend? And it isn't the Chancellor, it isn't Liz Kendall, it's Keir Starmer himself who the public blame. And it has had an impact on his personal ratings. We have him at minus 43 net disapproval now, which is the lowest we've had him. Hopefully, for him, this is the low. But he is the one who seems to be damaged rather than Rachel Reeves.
I think the leaders always get it, right? Even despite sometimes the efforts of their nearest and dearest professionally to make sure that the blame is spread everywhere apart from at the front door of Downing Street, I think actually the reality is that the Prime Minister always gets it, whoever's fault things are in government. I think it is worth saying that the government, as you were saying, Paddy, they still have lots of things on their side. I think the interesting thing for me is what are they actually going to change? And we talked a lot about it yesterday, so we don't have to go over it again. But a question to you, Luke, if they make changes in how things work internally and in terms of, sort of how Number 10 works, does the public care about that? Do they notice that, or they just notice if it's a shambles?
They just noticed if it's a shambles. Most of the public have no interest in the internal workings of government. They just want to know that government is working well. And one element of that, and I should say, is we track not just how popular certain policies are, but how much they cut through. And one of the really interesting things we found is actually Labour's done loads of stuff which is popular. The minimum wage, renters, workers, Great British Energy, all very popular when we poll it. But they have nowhere near the cut-through of the negative stuff, winter fuel, disability benefits, prisoner releases. And so I think part of the challenge actually of this year, I know that people are sometimes dismissive of blaming comms for things, but I do think comms actually is part of it. And if they can get those popular but not very well-known policies into the spotlight, people might start to go, actually, this is quite good.
And it's storytelling, isn't it? I mean, I think it is a bit of is a bit trite often in Westminster, and poor people who work in comms say, don't blame comms, we're only dealing with what we have. But the importance of storytelling is huge. And actually one MP said to me this week that Starmer their phrase was, has to hire for it. As in, you know, he himself has to make it a priority. And someone else who knows Starmer well said to me last week, one of the issues that they have, and I'm paraphrasing, is that Keir Starmer has always sort of believed once he's said something once, that sort of people will know then that that's his position. And, you know, famously, actually, in political arguments, you have to say them again and again and again and again. And like people like us might be bored to tears, but we're the saddos who are obsessed with this. And we know that, oh, you've said that 49 times, oven ready, or make whatever it is. But actually, for the public who are quite understandably not paying huge attention to the minutiae or dipping in every now and then, repetition, telling the same story is something that, you know, a lot of Labour MPs think the government and the leadership has to take that more seriously.
And Rishi Sunak did have a number of slogans which he hoped would bring home his message in time and save the Conservatives. One of them was stop the boats. He's recently said that was a mistake because it's 3 words which did land with voters, and he couldn't do it. And therefore, it's a message that it's the wrong message. So we're saying that we expect them to come back from the recess with a reboot, we've been saying on yesterday's newscast. Do you predict that yourself, Luke? I mean, are you not in the predictions business?
I don't like doing predictions because politics is so unpredictable. You know, I thought this was going to be quite a boring year for polling and public opinion after the general election. I thought I'd be putting my feet up, and it has been, you know, entirely the opposite. But I think, look, the good thing for the government is the public genuinely want them to succeed, right? They want to make improvements to the country. And so I think they've got longer to get here and come back in autumn, start showing progress, start telling some of the story. And as Laura says, you know, hammer it home to people.
Because I heard some Conservatives, I can't remember if this is in my ear or on the air, but at the time,
or in your imagination.
No. They said to me, I didn't vote for him, but I do hope he succeeds because the country needs it. Because there genuinely has been the most horrific few years for the country, says everybody in politics. So if you think about, we've spoken about the COVID horror, deaths in care homes, the furlough scheme, which was hugely costly to people's mental health, and there were some winners, I understand that, but it's hugely costly to the Treasury. So we want the country to come out and be fixed and get young people inspired and find industries that are working around the world. We want to invest in the right things. We want all these things, what we want.
And also, I think for people who work in and around politics, you want the political system to look like it actually can function, because it's not just that there were terrible events that were difficult for the country. It was also that for years, what the public saw was a political system that did not work, that was stuck in gridlock, that was screaming and shouting in Parliament, the Brexit rows and all the rest. And that was discombobulating and depressing for lots of people involved in politics. And I think this government carries that duty very seriously. They feel it's on them to demonstrate to the public that government can actually be a force for good in this country, which it has not come across that way to the public for a long, long time. But it was interesting listening to Bridget Phillipson this morning try to respond to this focus group, because we played her the comments and she, the Education Secretary, had to sit there and gamely listen through it as people were, you know, giving her and her colleagues a bit of a rough time. And it was interesting to listen how she tried to respond it. She'd given the government 7 out of 10 for their performance. But this is how she tried to sort of say, yes, we're listening and I promise we'll do things a bit differently.
I mean, that does chime with what I've heard from voters across the country. I was knocking on doors in Sunderland in recent days, and I hear that same frustration from voters, which is they voted for change. They want to see that change, both in terms of cost of living, you know, in their communities and their lives. And we hear that. We recognise that. And whilst I do think we've achieved a lot in that first year, there have undoubtedly been challenges along the way. We haven't got everything right. Of course we haven't. And now, going into this second year, it's about how we take that forward, how we really drive through and deliver on what I hear loud and clear people want.
Recess is coming. Then they come back. We're predicting a reboot of sorts. Laws told us that the big test is the May 2026 series of elections around the UK, and that's other than any unknown by-election. Do you think that's going to be the time? Laws compared it to the midterms, the US midterms. Is it feeling like, never mind your public opinion polls, that is the big looming milestone?
Oh, absolutely, because you've got Scotland voting, you've got Wales voting, and just to go back to the polls, in some of the polls now, you've got Labour not even in the top two in Wales at the moment, Plaid and Reform ahead, and then you've got local elections all around England, in London, in some of the big metro areas. Some of those independent candidates, or whatever this new left-wing party looks like, will be looking to do really well in some of those inner-city local elections.
They get 10% in the polls, apparently, don't they? They're not much more than that, the new left-wing.
But they might, they could get as much as that. Thank you very much for being with us, everybody. Paddy and I will be back next Saturday, but goodbye for now.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.